for inviting me to join you, and it's really good to be talking in this last of the Data for Good month of the Data Science Festival. The project I'm talking about, the Global Data Barometer, is really trying to understand how data for the public good is unfolding right across the globe, and we're at the midpoint of designing and rolling that project out, and I'll tell you a bit about it over the talk and try and find the points of connection where it could be a real resource to those using data science as a tool of social change. And really it starts from this premise that if data is to be a resource to solve the world's problems, then we need to understand the realities of data right across the world. To give a bit of introduction to myself and lead into the talk, I've spent the last decade tracking the evolution of the open data landscape, from one where back in 2009, we had advocacy for raw data, now calls for governments to get data sets up on data portals. And to put it bluntly, we had a lot of dumping decontextualized data on the web and not necessarily curating and maintaining it. It let us do some interesting experiments, pilot projects, but didn't necessarily lead to sustainable impact. But we then saw a maturing of that field, from calling for that raw data to calling for data that is published with a purpose, and the development of international data infrastructures that we can use to solve pressing problems. So my own history that involved working on data standards like the Open Contracting Data Standard to standardized procurement data, government procurement data from across many different countries, work on grants data through a project called 360 Giving, and then setting up a workers' co-op to support that work. But most recently, about 2 years ago, I was part of the team that published a co-edited collection called The State of Open Data, which explored where we got to over 10 years of an open data landscape. We looked at 16 different sectors, thematic areas, from public finance to transport to climate action, and many different stakeholder groups and cross-cutting themes. And one of the important narratives emerging from that work was the role that open data has played in powering public interest data science, and most importantly, allowing us to have a better public conversation about the ways in which data is shaped, used, and governed. In a sense, opening up data brought many more actors into the discussion around what data can do, and helped engage a lot more than just the private sector or enterprise world in thinking about the public potential of data. And that supported conversations not only about making more public data available for data science uses, but also encouraged thinking about what the World Bank's World Development Report, which was published yesterday, well worth a read, that this year's World Development Report focused entirely on data for better lives. And that refers also to the value of private intent data, data that's collected in the private sector that could be made more available for public good reuses. But for all those things to happen requires regulation, it requires capacity, it requires the data to be there and fit for purpose, and it requires demand and use. And so the Global Data Barometer aims to provide insights, information, and data about data that can support both the conversations about data for the public good and action on it. And it builds on a study that I was involved in designing at the World Wide Web Foundation a number of years ago, and that ran for 4 editions from 2012, called the Open Data Barometer. That surveyed open data readiness, implementation, and impact, and was used as a benchmark by a number of governments. It was used to shape a lot of different research projects into the impacts of data on development outcomes. And it's been used as a metric to promote increases in open data activity across a range of themes, from procurement transparency to data for land governance. And in the Global Data Barometer, we take a step back and we look broader. We still build a multi-dimensional index. I can say more about the kind of structure of that in Q&A if wanted. But we look at this framing of data for the public good. And in that concept, we are looking broader than just ad hoc uses of data for good. There are many projects out there that take data, do something interesting, and with it we might class good. But whether those add up to a country actually having the infrastructure, having the ecosystem to use data for the public good is a different question. Because we start from the idea in the project that data is a source of power. And that power can be exploited for private gain and used to limit freedoms, or it can be deployed and governed for the public good in ways that make it a resource for tackling health, social, environmental challenges, that help it enable collaboration, that drive innovation, that improve accountability. But whether or not data does that is not just about the availability of the data or the way it's used, it's about the wider setup it's in. So we look at 4 pillars in the barometer. We look at data governance, capability, availability, use, and impact. And in order to understand what counts as the public good, we draw on 2 sources. We draw particularly on the Sustainable Development Goals, which I hope many are familiar with. They're the internationally agreed goals for targeting where we want the world to be by 2030, owned in a sense by the UN, but applying to all countries in the world. These 17 goals on screen, they are supported by a framework of targets and indicators. And there's been lots of focus in the data for development world on the statistical data we need to monitor progress towards these SDGs, or the way that big data can help us track progress. But in the barometer, we're asking the question, well, how does operational data, how does data that you can use to improve decision making on a day-to-day basis support the delivery of these goals? So what data do you need to improve practice on quality education, or to reduce inequality, or to support a clean energy revolution? But as we're assessing countries and comparing them, we not only use the SDGs, we also look at the particular global agreements and frameworks where countries have already agreed to record and share data in ways that make it reusable. Everything from the International Open Data Charter to thematic agreements, conventions. And it's been a fascinating journey over the last 6 months as we've looked into all sorts of bits of international agreement, law, and so on, to find where are the traces of recognition that implementing policy in the modern age revolves around the data you capture and supply and the standards you set for that data. And we're seeing really interesting differences in how mature different spaces are on that. But let me just unpack a bit more what we come to explore in these pillars of the project. In the governance pillar of the barometer, we're exploring how data aware laws and legal frameworks are. For example, do procurement laws provide the basis for reliable data on how government is signing contracts for PPE in the COVID pandemic? Or, as perhaps is the case in the UK, do those laws leave loopholes that mean the data that's available lags reality by months or fails to reflect actual contracts and spending? i.e., if there isn't the legal or governance basis for producing quality data, can you do the data science on top of that can get to solid conclusions? Or are there going to be gaps in what you can achieve with analysis of that data? In the availability section of the barometer, we then look in depth at the qualities of data that's produced. So that procurement data that then is published, well, does it have the data fields you're going to need in order to link it to corporate records, or understand exactly what's been bought and sold and whether the pricing is fair or not? And then in our work on capability and use and impact, and across the study, we ask questions about inclusion, equity, and particularly gender equity, designing those indicators to reflect the messy reality of the world, rather than simple rationalizations that can occur if you look only through a narrow database lens. And we do this all for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I've said, if you're going to build a sustainable data analysis that can save government money or improve land rights of the vulnerable, you want to know that the data you're drawing on is reliable. Or if you find something in that data that challenges the interests of the powerful, is that data going to disappear overnight, or is that data going to still be there? Secondly, if you're going to use data from a new country to test a model developed in another context, for example, to improve public transport, do you have the local understanding of how that data is generated, where its strengths and weaknesses are, and the wider context it's in? And thirdly, in the study, we're interested in exploring at scale how data governance, capability, availability, use and impact interact. So in one of the early studies I worked on in that timeline earlier that's informed this work, a project called Open Data in Developing Countries, we explored how in practice there's a bit of fungibility between data quality and the capability of the data analysts. You know, if you've got poor quality source data, some of that can be made up by investing in capability downstream, but that only works in the short term. In the long term, if you want to scale up a country's capacity to use data for the public good, those data quality issues may need to be fixed at source. But we need the empirical evidence to try and explore those questions to guide policy making and investment. Because as I say, that World Development Report published yesterday calls for a big global conversation on the social contract around data and significant national investments in data infrastructures and ecosystems, and we're doing that curiously, even though this is a conversation about data, often very data blind as to what has the greatest impact. So racing through this, but hopefully giving some sense of what the barometer is trying to understand. So how are we trying to understand it? Well, we are very much a data-driven and open data project, and we use two key methods. We draw on existing secondary data, but the biggest part of our work is going into the field with an expert survey in over 100 countries to fill knowledge gaps. So there is a lot of existing data out there about data policies, practices, availability, and so on. But firstly, it can be very hard to find. So we've been spending a lot of time curating, and we'll share later this year, a collection of openly licensed sources that tell you about everything from data protection laws and right to information regimes to countries' civil society capacity or government capacity to work with data. But that data is not only hard to find, but it's also got quite a lot of data gaps in it. And so our expert survey, we're organizing through a network of regional hubs so that our research is carried out by people based in country who have a deep understanding of their country context. Right now, our hubs network, you can see on screen the logos of our partners. They're busy recruiting those researchers across about 120 countries who are going to be gathering evidence in the next few months to give us a much clearer picture of whether governments have clear data strategies in place, whether there are legal guarantees that data of particular kinds is supplied, whether the data sets collected have the features we need, and to give us a sense of where data is being used already and where the gaps are in use. And I think that's going to be really interesting to track the spread of certain data for good applications around the world and to understand why certain projects are working in one setting but less likely to occur in another. So that's our big upcoming piece of work. Of course, it's a very time-consuming and resource-intensive thing to do that data collection. So we've been developing survey tooling and workflows to make our researchers' job as straightforward as possible. But overall, we're really just trying to get much more in-depth insights into the work. Now, we're going to skip over a few bits for time. But really, one of the key kind of pieces I want to touch on is how we can then use the data that comes out here. So firstly, we are aiming to produce high-level metrics to guide policy and practice, play into global discussions, highlighting the relative strengths and weaknesses of different countries' national data ecosystems. But we also want to provide in-depth, open data about data that's useful to a wide range of other projects. We're doing that through working with a range of thematic partners who want to use this data to understand what's happening for data for the public good in energy, health, land, political integrity, climate action, and so on. But we're also aiming to make this useful in a data science context for perhaps people here. So there's three ways we're hoping that this is useful. Firstly, and before we get to any of the data about data, the background research we've been doing aims to build a better understanding of the complexity that has to be taken into account when developing data for the public good projects that scale. For example, we've worked with Land Portal who, by the way, curates some fantastic sets of data on land data governance with a very smart linked data backend to their platform that really takes the hassle out of working with data from many different sources. But in working with Land Portal, we've been documenting the complexity of land data, the things that you need to take into account to use it in a socially just way when you step outside of, say, a UK context where we think quite simply about land ownership to a context where land tenure is much more messy with overlapping forms of communal land ownership, indigenous rights, things that aren't often reflected in the simplest data set to get hold of, but that are important to understand if you want to develop a project that doesn't just produce a one-off outcome, but can produce sustainable change aligned with those sustainable development goals. Secondly, we are hoping, though, that the indicator data we release gives a general impression of where countries are at. So one thing we've encountered with a lot of our partners is the desire to work out just where do you pilot and scale particular data innovation. So if it's, again, using data analytics to understand corruption risk in procurement or land deals or other aspects of public finance, there are certain countries that are going to be more amenable because of their governance, because of their data supply, because of maybe the data protection regimes being strong enough to let you do things with personal data as well, where you can take those projects forward, and other settings which really you shouldn't necessarily go to in the first instance. So we want to have a resource that gives that high level impression. But lastly, we want to provide data that's an input into further data science projects and that supports a more global view. So definitely one of the starting points in the project was a recognition that the biases in what we know about the data landscape around the world skew very heavily towards Europe, North America, and some parts of Asia, but not all. And that means the applications, the tools being built often skew in those directions too. So with over 1,000 data points per country on the data ecosystem in different countries, we're hoping there's a data set here that can be analyzed, explored in new ways, and that's going to provide links to open shared public data sets on issues that matter, and to do so with much more inclusive global coverage than existing sources. So not only will we provide a list of those data sets from right across the globe, we'll also have a sense of which of those contain the fields you need to join the dots to perform particular analysis, to understand and create impact. So as I say, our roots are in supporting policy and practice, but was invited to talk to you on the kind of data science festival. So trying to make those connections to where we can also support data science practice. And we were certainly delighted early in the project to partner with data.org, another platform for global data for good that many of you may be familiar with, but if you're not, well worth following what data.org are doing. And it's our hope that the kinds of data we're gathering will strengthen applications of data science as a tool for development. So coming up to time, I said in the blurb for this talk that we'd also highlight some of the opportunities coming up to shape the GDB. Right now, we're finalizing the design of that expert survey I mentioned, and we've got consultations out on the thematic questions in there, particularly right now, consultation out on the website about climate action and land governance indicators. And in the next few weeks, we'll be releasing our full draft survey and inviting feedback. And we're really open to people saying, you know, I've got a data science project in mind that would really benefit if you could ask this question in 100 countries of the world and tell us what's going on with that source or that data point. So if people have got feedback, really keen to kind of hear that. Our regional hubs network are currently looking to find sponsors who can help extend their work, particularly looking for help to provide full coverage of the EU, as our development sector funding doesn't currently cover that. And lastly, we're starting to look to when, come September, October this year, we have this large data set of the state of data for the public good around the world. And we're keen to start planning for how we use that in a wide range of different ways. So if you have managed to get a sense from my presentation of what we'll be delivering and would be interested in being a user of that, then really keen to start those conversations. So there's details up on screen of how to contact me. and I'm really happy to follow up on conversations. And I should just in closing really reiterate that this is a partnership project. Incredibly grateful we are to our regional and thematic and funding partners who've made the project possible, our anchor funder, the Data for Development Network of Canada's International Development Research Centre, but also these many other partners who've been helping us move this forward. And I'm very privileged to work with a fantastic core team across 4 continents on the daily work to make this project a reality. And so just the one that kind of sharing about it here, but there's a lot more people shaping and developing this behind me. So thank you for the chance to share with you what we're doing.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. That was very enjoyable, and it's carried on the theme of my month in that I probably had little awareness joining the talk, and I feel like I've spent 20 minutes very well spent learning about what you guys have been working on. So that's fantastic. One of the first questions I had was actually around the, how was it funded, and how did you get to this point? So I'm glad you touched on that in the end. I guess one of the questions I have as well is, how or who gets to access this information? Is it open to people that are listening now, or is it for other partners? How does it work?
Absolutely. So one of the commitments in the project is open data throughout. So everything we're generating in terms of the tools, resources, guidance, and then the data set that will come out of the project later this year will all be fully available under an open data license. One of the things we've been working really hard on, so I mentioned the Open Data Barometer, the project that's kind of our predecessor study, that also opened its underlying data, but some of the things were never made super accessible in terms of when we assessed the availability of data sets, we didn't capture great metadata on, where's the direct download URL you can hit to look at public budget data sets. And we're hoping what we will have this time is the collection of those well curated so that data scientists can do some really interesting things by just grabbing all of that and analyzing in ways that are perhaps beyond our social research team.
Yeah, fantastic. I think there's a few other speakers that jump to mind. One of our very good friends of the festival, Lawrence, he seems to have in his own head all these open data sets just mulling around, and he normally knows where to go. But to have it all curated is fantastic. In terms of, I guess, wider questions, have you got particular use cases, or where the data barometer is useful to data scientists, working on specific projects and things like that?
Yeah, so maybe the area I worked on most, where we're really interested in how it will be used, is anti-corruption work, where there's a lot of work on sort of red flag analysis and understanding corruption risks, and that requires joining the dots between lots of different data sets. So it requires connecting, spending data sets, company ownerships data sets, political data to politically exposed persons. And one of the things we're trying to really map is which countries have that joined up set up, because what we've seen in the past is really interesting innovative projects set off in a country trying to prove how you can use that analysis to and it'd be really interesting, fintech month coming up, a lot of fintech work on compliance, on kind of audit, on risk management. So projects are set off saying, where can we use public data to do this? And many of them either falter because the data is it's sort of available, but it doesn't connect, it doesn't join up, or they manage to do it one-off, but by doing a lot of manual work that's just not replicable, because when you join up different government data sets, unless that government has taken an intentional approach to making them interoperable, making them work together, you're going to have a lot of headaches. And so that's why one of the real applications, I think, will be helping people say, look, I've got this proof of concept that needs these things to be in place, and we'll be able to give you a much better sense of, are those data sets in place because you had a fantastic civil servant who on a one-off basis managed to get it there, but once they've left the job, that data is going to go dark and your whole project's going to fall apart? Or has this been baked into law that says, actually, there's an institution who produced this, they've got funding, you can rely on that data being there? Because I think I'm really curious, how can we present that in a way that helps the data scientists? Because I know often, when you approach a data science problem, you want to solve the problem. You don't want to have to deal with that much wider context. So hopefully we give the questions to ask and some of the answers.
Perfect. Yeah, it sounds good to all the data scientists out there for sure. I've kind of going to merge two questions into one here. We're a little bit conscious of time. So a question I had personally was, how is the data collected into the barometer? Are you using big data sources? But we've also had a question coming from Alexander, who's watching along, talking about some of the data blanks. So they're saying, what's the best way to fill in the data blanks in Africa? Could NGOs play a key role in supplying data that governments aren't collecting or don't want to share? So, briefly, how do you get the data in there? Where there are blanks, particularly in Africa, can NGOs help?
Yeah, there's two really good questions in there. So for our own mapping of what's happening around the world, we did look at early in our design at can we use some big data sources? And there are other projects out there like Element AI's Global AI Talent Report that do some really interesting things with bibliographic data and LinkedIn data, but they hit a big bias problem. They really slant towards those North American, kind of European, and they just ignore a lot of the world because they're using different platforms. So that's why we've gone with this idea of our biggest source is local experts on the ground who know the language, know the country, know the context, partly to balance those other data sets. So we're hoping that that will also act as a bit of a check on is what you're getting from those other sources representative or not, when we're drawing global conclusions. On that point on, kind of how do we address the more substantive data gaps in Africa? If a country is not collecting certain data, how do we meet that gap? And I think there's really interesting work going on, ranging from looking at where can big data provide answers, where can civil society. Generally, those things struggle to become really comprehensive. So we are though trying to track where are the rules in place and the laws in place that can support collaboration between the public and private sector to fill gaps, and also to think really carefully about which data sets can you do this for and which can't you. So if you're thinking demographics and you thinking with an inclusion lens, there's a real challenge to using some of those big data sets. But if you're thinking about other kind of applications, there's been some great work in Nigeria, again on procurement data, which I know very well, of civil society taking the messy documents and transcribing them and then doing smart data analytics on government procurement documents. So civil society can do it. It's often only a short-term stopgap. So again, that's kind of why one of the things I didn't mention in the GDB is we're aiming for 10 years of this project to every 2 years revisit, and to hopefully again be able to say something clearer on how do you make civil society sustainable, or how do you go from civil society innovation to government owning and taking on board the solution.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. There is one other question there from Nina. Nina, it's a very good question. I'm going to keep it for the very end of the webinar. Depending on how we're running with time, we might be able to get Tim back just to jump onto that last question from you. But just in terms of wrapping that up, Tim, thank you very, very much. It was a really enjoyable talk, and very much, thank you for your time in sharing with us. I think now I welcome the next speaker, and but I will get you back at the end, Tim, to say a final thank you. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining us. How has your day started? Are you okay today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. So everyone at home, this is Chris Owen. He is a manager in the DigiLabs team at Social Finance. He's going to be giving us a session today on maximising access to education, using data to understand who's at risk of exclusion. I would like to know if one of the data points is a tartan shirt, because if it is, I may be in trouble. No, so if you're happy, Chris, I'll get you to share your screen, and we'll get on with your session.
Great, thanks, David, and also thanks, Tim. That was a really fascinating talk, and I think actually a lot of the challenges that you're talking about are things that I've experienced firsthand in trying to do data analysis to be supporting vulnerable populations. And in fact, it seems like we're trying to address many of the same barriers from the bottom up. So yeah, thank you for having me today. I'm keen today to talk through one specific example of one of our projects around maximising access to education and school exclusions. But I think more broadly, one of the challenges we face as an organisation, social finance, is around how to help local authorities and charities and others make better use of their data. We find that there's a lot of great data out there that exists, but it's not reaching its full potential. So as well as talking through one specific project, I also talk through some of the barriers that we found to using this data in the best ways possible. So just a very quick bit of background. So who are social finance? Our name can be a bit confusing at times, but what we are is a not-for-profit that is focused around strategy and data. And our mission really is around improving outcomes for vulnerable people. So as an organization, there's a couple of key elements of our approach. So we're very much outcomes focused. So we don't want to think too much about processes, and we know that often actually the wrong things are being measured. And so we want to ensure that the right outcomes are at the core of our work. We're user-centered, so all of our team is trained in user research and user-centered design, and so we can design and think from users and vulnerable populations perspectives. We're very much about collaborating across boundaries, so breaking down barriers between foundations, local government, charities, and the private sector, and also breaking down silos even locally within different teams between government, and trying to find solutions that work across all. We're very much around capacity and not dependency. So you'll see today, we've got this piece of analysis, but what we're hoping is we don't have to be the ones that keep going around and do this piece of analysis for everybody else, and that actually we can help build the capacity of the sector in the long run to be able to do this kind of thing themselves. And then finally, it's around learning and adapting. So the social finance has been around for around 10 years. The digital labs team that I'm a part of has been around for about 5, but we're constantly learning, we're constantly adapting. Even our data science practice is something that we've built up over the last few years. So we're always looking to learn and change and take in the latest about what works.
Hey everyone, I think Chris has just had a quick internet problem there. So we did have this in a bit of a warm up earlier. So hopefully he'll be back in 1 second and we'll carry on where we left off. But we'll just see what we're doing behind the scenes. So I'm keeping an eye on it. If you just give us 30 seconds, I'll be right back with you.
That was inevitable, wasn't it? I had crystal clear connection all the way through the last presentation.
Mate, I was killing it, padding. You've missed out on some great jokes. Mate,
I'll have to
go back to where we were.
Yeah. Where did I drop out? Did I get to talking about the project?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mate, if you flick up we haven't got the screen share anymore, so if you flick that up.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. So yeah. Hopefully, fingers crossed, no more tech issues. So yeah, today I'm really keen to talk to you about our analysis of school exclusions and who's most at risk of receiving them in Cheshire West and Chester. I think this is a really great example of the potential of the available data and how it can help inform local decision making about vulnerable populations. And also, as the one who went through much of the process of getting this whole thing in motion, a good opportunity to talk about some of the barriers of getting this type of analysis into the hands of more people. So a little bit about the issue. So every day, a classroom of 35 children are told to permanently leave mainstream education, and this is on the rise. This is obviously not good, but there's a lot of good data out there about how much more likely excluded pupils are to end up with poor life outcomes. So they're less likely to go on to achieve good GCSEs. Many go on to become not in education or training. It's also a strong predictor of children being susceptible to criminal exploitation. And I think this one always strikes me as really, really stark. It's that 58% of young adults in prison were permanently excluded at school. Aside from the obvious social costs here, there is a financial cost as well, which is estimated at around £370,000 per child in terms of their education, benefits, healthcare, etc. So we were brought in by Cheshire West and Chester Council, and it was to understand which students are most at risk of exclusion locally, and how best to support the target support to these students. So we did a lot of user research, speaking to schools, AP providers, their special educational needs team. And then kind of the bulk of this work was around our data analysis. So we joined together about 700 individual files. Good example of the massive data sets that are sometimes not super easy to work with that you come across in local government. This was covering schools, social care, special educational needs, deprivation, and a whole range of factors. And this enabled us to build out a longitudinal picture of the journey a child takes through school. And there's an example of that at the bottom of this slide. So with teachers and the council, we identified 4 key questions that would really help to target support to students. So who are the children at risk of exclusion? Where should we be targeting support to them? When is the best time to be putting support in place for these students? And then how? So what kind of support do we want to put in place for these students? So I guess just to flag, I'm going to talk through these findings. It's not our full report, and I can share a link to that to be sent around afterwards, I guess. And but I'll give you a bit of a taste of some of the findings and how they informed the local response. So in terms of who gets excluded, what we found is by joining these data sets together for the first time, we were able to see a whole range of risk factors and how these contributed to greater risk of exclusion. And what we saw is that there are a small group of students who are far more likely to be excluded than their peers. So whilst only 3% of overall students are likely to receive 2 or more fixed term exclusions from school. So this is up to 5 days exclusion. Actually, when we get into our high vulnerability cohorts, so those with social, emotional, and mental health needs, or those who've had contact with children's services, the probability of having had multiple exclusions increases significantly. And you can see it goes up to 43% of looked after children have had 2 or more fixed term exclusions. Another stark finding was that actually the most at risk 15% of students are the ones who are accumulating most of the exclusions that are actually being seen. So we saw that students with social, emotional, or mental health needs or social care contact, despite making up only 15% of the total school population, actually made up 58% of students with multiple exclusions. So really strong indicator to us that these are the students where there is a need to target support first. Going on to where we should support children at risk of exclusion. We were fortunately able to access postcode data for students, which meant that we could look at where these students were based and where all of these exclusions were coming from. And what we could see is that exclusions were highly focused in the areas where there was the greatest deprivation, and we use the indices of multiple deprivation here to create that measure of deprivation. And you can see on the top row here, that's the rate of multiple exclusions. And on the bottom, we've got the deprivation level of the local areas. So the dark red are the two most deprived areas by the indices of multiple deprivation. So what it said to us is support should be really targeted around those urban areas with high levels of deprivation, rather than perhaps rural areas, as there are a lot of in Chester West and Chester. So the next question for us was around, well, when do we support these children? What's the best time to put it in support to make sure that these children are at reduced risk of exclusion? And the way that we did this, the way that we answered this question was by looking at attendance over time. So we could plot a student's attendance all the way up until their first exclusion or school move event, and look at how the attendance pattern had changed prior to that event. And what we saw is that for students who are being permanently excluded, so excluded from school and not able to return, attendance deteriorates in the year leading up to the exclusion, and quite significantly as well. So really strong indicator there that the child may be at risk. But I think what was really interesting for us is that we could also see that in the term prior to the first fixed term exclusion, so the less permanent one, but so for a period of 5 days or less, attendance would worsen in that period too. So it really suggested to us that when considering which students should be targeted with interventions, seeing that decline in attendance is a really good indicator that a student might have some unmet need. Finally, we wanted to talk about, well, how do we support children at risk of exclusion? It's all well and good to say who and what, and like when they might require support, but actually what support you provide and how you focus that support is obviously key for a local authority to have in order to make decisions. And so one of the big questions that came up emerged from the fact that we could see that the number of exclusions given varied hugely between schools. So if you look at each of these lines, actually that each one of those is a different secondary school, and it's the proportion of students that have had 2 or more fixed term exclusions. And what you can see is that in the highest excluding schools, there are huge amounts, and there's just a massive variation here. So we're really wondering whether the lowest excluders were potentially doing something better, where there are lessons that could be taken for those schools with high levels of exclusions. And what we found that was really interesting is that the exclusion rate is far more driven by levels of disadvantage than it is by school policy, which was a quite surprising finding for the local authority at the time. So whilst the rates of exclusions do vary, it's predominantly explained by the variation in levels of deprivation, special educational needs, and contact with social care within the school itself. So for us, the real key finding of this is that support needs to be targeted to fundamental needs, not necessarily around changing school policy, although there obviously is some factor of school policy too. So what does this all mean? I mean, it's great to be able to do this analysis, but I think unless it's going to be practically useful for a local authority, then what's the point of doing it? And I wanted to talk a bit about what happened as a result of this analysis. So one of the perks of doing this analysis with an organization like Social Finance is that the work doesn't finish when the analysis is done. We're not just handing it over and then it's the local authority's responsibility. We have a team now that's working with the local authority to develop their local response. And that local response now has a set of principles which have emerged directly from the findings of this work. So early intervention. So the fact that there was such a low effect of school policy and clearly identifiable child and family risk factors suggested early intervention is key in any local response. Targeted support is key because we know that there's a small group of students with high risk, this 15% of students that are getting 58% of multiple exclusions. Place-based, we could see that the most at-risk students fall into small geographical pockets. So targeting support around a few schools with local interventions seems like a good way of embedding an approach. And then finally, making sure that any intervention is child-centered. So the number of different risk factors that are associated with the different forms of exclusion suggests that a one-size-fits-all solution wasn't going to be the most appropriate. And so an intervention that is designed in a trauma-informed way would be most effective. I'm conscious of my time, so I'm going to keep rocketing through. So what's also been really exciting about this analysis is that it's played a role in shaping the national conversation, and that's very much something that we have aimed to do here. So it's been published in The Guardian, some of the findings that came out of this. We've spoken on Woman's Hour on the BBC. And then I think most exciting here, if you're a local government nerd like myself, is that we were invited to speak at the all-party parliamentary group that was established to look into school exclusions and alternative provision. And I think here we can see that there's a real impact of doing this analysis and being able to shape the policy conversation beyond that local response. So this is all well and good. But I think our ambition at Social Finance is to build the capacity of the sector to do this analysis themselves, rather than us doing this all the time. And I think there are some significant barriers to doing so that we've identified through this work. The first is data is siloed. Even just getting this data all into one place was a difficult task. And it's often not focused around capturing the right piece of information in the first place. The second piece is that tools often aren't based on user needs. So there were a whole load of reports that already existed in Chester, Western Chester, but none of them were answering these key questions that could help inform their local response. And anything that is designed like that isn't designed to scale necessarily. We also ran into huge problems with information governance. So it took about 6 months to get access to this data, which is a crazy amount of time. And you can see how that puts up significant barriers to being able to do this really impactful piece of work and analysis. And then finally, I think data ethics is crucial. We really understand the importance of this, but it's a difficult conversation to have and takes time and consideration. So I'll give a very quick run through of what we're doing to build on this analysis to try and tackle some of those barriers going forward. And then I'll open it up for questions. So one of the really exciting pieces that we've done recently, it was actually my original topic of this talk before PERDA meant that I wasn't able to share any of the findings, is we did a piece of analysis around what was the impact of COVID-19. And because we'd already done this infrastructure building, we were very easily able to quickly repurpose this analysis to say which students had been most impacted by COVID-19 in the local area. More broadly, we've looked to replicate this analysis. So turning it from being one piece into something that can be picked up and planted in any local authority. And we do that using common data models and building these kind of shared tools that are accessible. We've also got an apprenticeships program. So we recognize this has taken Python and data science skills, but not everyone has those. And to be able to work with these kind of data sets and even a scalable tool often requires those skills. So we've supported the development of an apprenticeships program, which will upskill local authority data analysts in how to use Python and data science. And then finally, we're linking in as much as we can with communities where communities of data analysts, communities across local authorities, to ensure that when these pieces of analysis are done, whether it's by us or by others, they can be picked up and planted elsewhere so that a wide range of local authorities can benefit beyond just the ones where the analysis is initially created. So I do want to leave some time for questions. So I'll pause there and open it up to the wider group. I guess just one thing before I do. At Social Finance, our data science capacity is really growing. This is really a really good example of the type of work we're doing, and we're increasingly doing more of. And we're always very eager to hear from anyone who's interested in this type of work. So if you're seeing this and thinking that's something I would love to be doing or be involved in, or if you've got connections otherwise on how to overcome some of those barriers that we've talked about, please do get in contact. We would love to hear from you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris. Again, very enjoyable talk, and it's brought a few questions straight to my mind. That's for sure. And I think one of the things that I always really enjoy looking at is this data-driven approach to a problem, and it does kind of make you wonder what things were like 40 years ago in terms of school exclusions and stuff like that. And I guess now you're taking this approach. How did you engage with the local authority, and how receptive were they to the findings, and I guess to your data-driven approach as well? And what I might ask you to do, Chris, if it's all right, I'll maybe get you to stop sharing your screen, just so people can see us a bit bigger. So
yeah.
Just as you're doing that, Sean in the audience was saying that's fantastic, Chris. What is Sean saying? Sean's also one of my favourites. Great piece of work and much empathy with some of the barriers data sharing. So we'll come to that question as well, Sean. Thank you very much. So yeah, just to recap what I was saying there. Yeah, how was it working with the local authority, and how receptive were they to your approach and making changes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think, as you might expect, you have differing levels of data literacy in the local authority. Particularly the people making the decisions around exclusions, are not necessarily the ones who are typically linked in with the data analysis teams. And so a lot of our work was actually around trying to bridge those gaps. And so we tried to operate in an agile way of working, which in itself is a bit of a journey to take a local authority along. But having a data subgroup where we would bring together teachers, the local authority, and the insights and intelligence team within the local authority to play back our findings, get their feedback, have interviews. We'd have interviews with them as well. And by having them heavily involved in the process and feeding back, I think you were able to bring them along that journey with you. And by the end, they were very much bought in. And the teachers who were involved in the data subgroup were able to kind of vouch for the analysis, I guess, to the wider group of teachers who perhaps hadn't been involved.
I think we're losing Chris again for a second. We'll just give him a minute and see if he comes back. At least we got through the talk. That was the main thing. You're still there, Chris?
They're putting fibre. Yeah, they're putting fibre into the street outside. I think that's probably what's.
So you're going to be super fast in a couple of weeks' time, but for now it's causing some problems, eh? We'll give Chris a second. As he's doing that, I will once again plug our upcoming months, FinTech Month, etc. We are also always looking for engagement within the community. So if any of you guys out there watching would like to give a talk, please do reach out and say hello. So welcome back, Chris. I think, mate, if you could unmute, I think you're back anyway. Sometimes I think I might just sit really still on these webinars and just see if everyone thinks I've frozen as well. Oh, he has to come back. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Thank you very much, Matthew, Alexander, Hamad.
Sorry about that. I think I'm hopefully back now.
Hey, you're back. You're back. It's perfect. I'm glad you've come back. Actually, we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. We'll blast through a couple of very quick questions, and then we'll wrap things up from there. So, a couple of super quick ones. First of all, Hamad's asked, is the complete analysis report available for download? I think you mentioned perhaps it was. Is that something that's available for everyone else?
Yeah. Shall I? Can I share that in the chat?
Yeah, if you stick that in the chat, that'll be absolutely fantastic. Cool. So we'll jump on to a question from Alexander just as you're doing that as well. So Alexander was saying, thanks, Chris. Great tool set for informing intervention choices. He'd love to hear more about the capacity building apprenticeships. Are these more widely available, e.g. for NGOs? Are you able to tell him any more about the apprenticeships?
That's a really good question. Again, probably best answered by me sharing a link around. I wonder if I can. I don't know if there's going to be a follow-up email that goes around.
Yeah, 100%. We'll do that in this case, actually. So we'll follow up on those two after, and make sure everyone that attended get sent those.
Just quickly, it's currently it's for children's services data analysts, but I think it would be really exciting to see it expand and be able to cover NGOs as well. I know there's a new cohort that will potentially happen in the latter half of this year. So I'll send around more info on that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Question from Matthew Jones. Really fascinating findings. Are there any plans to get data from individual students into the causes of their exclusion?
Yeah, I think really good question. I think it's something that is really fundamental to our work. So you've very much seen the data side of things because this is a data science talk, but our impact incubator team who's leading this ongoing work in Cheshire West and Chester is deeply engaged with an organization called Platform for Life, who are working closely with teachers, students, families, and getting that first-hand experience or that lived experience of that they have had of exclusions, and we're ensuring that that is also coming in alongside the data analysis in shaping the response, because I think it's obviously fundamental in understanding what's going on and what works.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I've got one final question. I am very conscious of time. One final question just to wrap things up. And I guess the question that was coming to mind as I was asking it was actually around, what kind of data privacy challenges did you face, when working on this type of analysis? I'd imagine there's quite a few.
Yeah, you almost don't want to get me started on that one. It's a long answer, but it's it's difficult. And it really, I think the main challenge is that there's a lack of clarity around guidance for it. So I will receive the same. We do lots of projects with lots of different local authorities, and we'll get from one local authority, we'll get the data set with the data sharing agreement signed off, and no problem, it can be turned around within 2-3 weeks. With some local authorities, it can take up to 6 months, huge amounts of time to get the same data sets. And I think that lack of clarity is a massive barrier to getting this analysis into the hands of local authorities. It would be fantastic if next time, instead of us doing this analysis, when, for example, COVID hits and local authorities want to understand what the impact of lockdown has been, for example, they can run this analysis themselves. But I think until we start to that's a long way away. And I think we're doing what we can to get there. But I think until that's in place, we need to think about how we can get better consistency and better guidance around data privacy to get that data more accessible.
Yeah, I think it loops back to a bit what Tim said in his talk as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're dealing with a really good individual and they're on it, you know, and you get the data and that person leaves and it all disappears. But fantastic. It was fantastic to learn more about what you're doing there, and the value is very clear to be seen as well. So I'm actually just going to ask Tim just to fire back up his camera just as we're wrapping things up. It is nice to get you both back on stage, as it were. So I just wanted to say, both of you, thank you for giving up your time. You know, I'm conscious you're giving up an hour of your day to come and share with our community, which we're very much appreciative of. Hopefully, as the year progresses, you never know, we may be able to get you back towards the end of the year for a bit of a recap. And even in a live event, if we can cross our fingers. But yeah, thank you both very much. And I hope you both enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks ever so much.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.